Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined via Zoom by Dr. Eric Hedin, a physicist. And today we're going to be discussing a really interesting and provocative question. How is it possible, if God is spirit, for him to interact and to affect our physical world? You don't want to miss this conversation. Well, Eric, thank you so much for coming back on Star Cells and God. I've really been looking forward to this conversation we're going to have today. So again, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Faz. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you again.
Oh, it's our pleasure and it's our honor by all means. Let me set the stage for us, if you allow me, Eric.
Sure.
Both of us are advocates for intelligent design, for the idea that there's a creator who brought the universe and life into existence, and that we can see evidence for his fingerprints in creation. But oftentimes when I present those kinds of arguments, skeptics oftentimes will fire back, well, how does God mechanistically influence the physical world, right? If God is a transcendent creator, he's spirit, how is it that he then, affects or even brings the universe into existence, let alone affects events happening in the universe? How does he mechanistically function as a creator? And I was doing a little bit of reading, and it turns out that this is actually a philosophical problem called the problem of divine interaction, or the causal joint problem. So this is a problem that many philosophers and theologians have engaged. And so when it comes to this question, though, it does have, again, an impact on making a case for intelligent design. Is it possible to posit a realistic, or at least a plausible, mechanism by which a creator who is immaterial could interact with the material world? But this also impacts the mind-brain problem too. Some people argue, look, the mind is the brain, because when you start positing the mind as an immaterial entity, now you've got a problem, because how does that immaterial entity affect the material brain, right? And so even for Christians who are just interested maybe in this question for devotional reasons, it's important. How is it that Jesus performed miracles where he created things as part of his ministry? So anyway, a fascinating question, and I'm really grateful that you're willing to take the time to kind of guide us through these series of questions. I know that you've spent some time thinking about this deeply. So first question is, Eric, how did you even get involved or get interested in this question? And what do you see as the apologetic value, or maybe even the devotional value for Christians?
Well, I believe that my experience that led me to research this topic it kind of parallels some of the points you already brought up here in the introduction, that sometimes when presenting evidence for design to a audience that includes skeptics, that the question comes back, okay, well, how did God do this? How did God create something? And oftentimes there's sort of the insinuation, I believe, in people's minds that anything spiritual, even including God, is sort of nebulous, we might say, or sort of incapable of interacting with the physical world. And I don't know where this comes from. It's certainly not a biblical notion. I often think of, at the moment of the resurrection of Christ, the angel that came down and rolled away this massive stone that was in front of Jesus' grave, and he sat on it. And so there was certainly no difficulty for a spiritual being to move a heavy material object. And but another argument that has come out and has been written about skeptics is, and you alluded to this as well, that somehow it is philosophically like limits or illegal for God to enter in any way in the world that might seem miraculous. And to do so, people would imply, suggests that maybe God did set things up properly originally, and he's got to kind of twiddle the knobs, so to speak, to fix the situation. And honestly, I mean, we could talk more about that, but I really believe that that's not a valid objection.
Yeah. Yeah, no, no, okay. That was a great response, Eric. And before we kind of start unpacking how you think about this question from the standpoint of a physicist, uh, just for the sake of the record, what do you see as the most compelling evidences for design and for a creator's involvement in the cosmos and in biological systems? You don't have to be exhaustive, but just out of curiosity, what do you see as those compelling evidences for design?
Well, there could be an exhaustive answer given to that. There's,
Yes,
I believe,
I know there.
a lot of evidence, a lot of different lines of evidence for design. Um, and broadly speaking, the most compelling ones that have impacted me as a scientist, as well as a Christian believer, are evidence from nature having to do with fine-tuning of physical parameters that allow for life to exist. And I'm aware of many counter arguments, multiverse or selection effects or whatever. But I believe that there are so many uh, examples of this type of fine tuning that it begins to suggest something to an honest inquiry, that it's more than just a string of unlikely coincidences. And also the level of fine tuning is far beyond, the knife edge aspect of it is far beyond what is at, the fundamental level necessary for life to exist.
Yeah,
So there's that. And then I believe also within biological systems, we see a level of purposefulness of design elements that are mirrored in how we as intelligent agents design.
yeah,
And so, except that what we find in biology is so far beyond anything that human engineers have been able to accomplish so far. So there's complexity there, and I believe that also tied in with that is just a limitation of what nature can do. We can't forget that
yeah,
nature is not an unlimited, all-powerful genie. Give it enough time, anything will happen. My experience with nature is that give it enough time, more of the same happens.
yeah.
Nature quickly settles into a redundancy that's not very special or complex and certainly not functional or purposeful.
Okay, so then I think, somebody who is a physicist is actually uniquely qualified to engage the question of divine interaction because, as a physicist, you're studying the interaction of the most fundamental entities in the universe, right? Subatomic particles.
Mhm.
So maybe give us a little bit of a review of how do, particles interact with each other, and maybe talk a little bit about uh, the electromagnetic force, gravitational force, but and things like the strong nuclear force. And again, how are those interactions mediated?
Sure, and I do agree that's a good place to start. Based on what we as scientists have unpacked about the universe, um, essentially four fundamental forces, and three of them really deal with attractions or repulsions between particles. You mentioned electromagnetic force, and even in a first year physics class, we would be instructing our students about the properties of charged particles that if they're like charges, both positive or both negative, there's a repulsive force, and the opposite, if they're oppositely charged, it's an attractive force. And so we've got a certain um, interaction, we would say, that it sets up a force, and the force can affect the motion of particles. It can cause acceleration. Um, if we dive down to another fundamental force, the strong nuclear force, which in its most essential manifestation holds the nucleons together in the nucleus. The protons and neutrons are held together in the nucleus by the strong nuclear force. And it's attractive at the typical distances between nucleon particles. Now, a little higher level physics would suggest that these forces are what we call mediated by exchange of other kinds of particles, like the electromagnetic force is mediated by the exchange of a photon, a massless um, corpuscle of energy, you might say, and that mediates the electromagnetic force. Nuclear forces are thought to be mediated by the exchange of another particle, a gluon. And then we could also talk about the other primary fundamental force, gravitational force. And there seems to be at least within Einstein's general relativity theory, a different means of interaction that gravity is a manifestation of the warping of space, um, or more properly, the warping of space-time. And this can cause attraction between masses. Um, Something that is significant is that with, say, the charged particles, acceleration of a charged particle can lead to the production of photons,
Mm.
uh, electromagnetic waves. Likewise, acceleration of massive particles, really big particles, such as maybe neutron stars. Accelerating neutron stars can produce gravitational waves. And so there seems to be a kind of a connection between the force and then a wave, a certain type that can affect other particles.
Mm.
And so in my articles, I suggest that maybe there are, perhaps, if we shift a little bit in towards the spiritual realm, other forces that we haven't been able to really scientifically detect yet that could produce waves, that could propagate, that could affect other particles. Um, we believe that we have covered the bases with the kind of forces we found, but it just might be that there's something out there beyond what we have already discovered that kind of follows the same trend of what we have discovered.
Well, this is an interesting point because, what you're describing is what we understand about how particles that are confined to the physical material universe are interacting and influencing each other. And so that establishes these cause and effect relationships. But of course, when we talk about God interacting as a transcendent creator, transcendent personal being with the physical material universe, that's a phenomena that we don't really have any kind of experience with. And so that suggests that there are a variety of mechanisms potentially that God could employ. And I think your point is, and maybe you could elaborate on this a little bit more, is that given what we know about how particles mediate, could this suggest maybe a mechanism that God could employ? So maybe unpack that a little bit more for us, if you don't mind, Eric.
Okay, so again, to probably preface this, I'm sure it's obvious, but I don't know the answers here. There's a high degree of speculation going. So the best I can do as a physicist is to extrapolate beyond things we do understand and try to make some sort of a guess about this topic that we don't fully understand. And yet it's fun. It's interesting. So perhaps to kind of lead into the idea of how God could interact, we might just consider our own minds. There's quite a body of actual evidence from neuroscience, from neurology and brain surgery that suggests that the mind of a human being is more than just the brain. And so that there's some sort of a immaterial aspect of the mind. And it's not just a result of kind of software-like operations within the neuronic activity of our brains. So if that's the case, then there must be a way for our to interact with our brain in order to kind of like use the brain as the interface between the mind and the body to get our bodies to things. Like I'm deciding to say something right now. We can argue didn't just come from predetermined synapses firing in my brain, but from an immaterial mind that decided to make a certain sentence and then affected the brain to cause my vocal cords and so on to produce the sound. So could God do the same thing? Is there some sort of a thought wave, we might even ask, something that could propagate and affect matter by means of what we would call thought? And, some may say, oh, he's crazy. Well, I'm not crazy. I'm just willing to voice the idea. I don't know, but it seems to be consistent with what we know. And so perhaps God can think in a way that can affect things more tangibly, more noticeably than just my own mind thinking and affecting my own brain.
Yeah, and I appreciate your humility and your point that this is again speculative, right? You know,
Yeah.
but I think the larger point in terms of engaging the apologetics question and the question for a skeptic is what you've presented is something that may or may not be the way it works, but it's at least something that's plausible that represents an extension of what we're very comfortable with in terms of particle interactions.
Yes, and so I think that is a way to approach the question. We start with what we at least have some understanding of, and then extrapolate it into another realm that we're considering. And even in physics, there are suggestions that things aren't quite as simple as we might have learned in a first year science class. For example, we might have learned about the distinction between mass, particles of nature, protons, electrons, neutrons, and then waves like light and um, even gravity waves. But it turns out that in higher level physics, of course, a lot of our listeners will know that this distinction begins to fade and that particles do behave like waves. And, they do things that seem inconsistent with the particle nature, like seemingly going through two spaces at once. They lack specific locality. Um, they can be entangled with other particles and seemingly affect each other at distances. And so then it also seems that particles, or rather, I would say that electromagnetic waves also take on a particle-like nature and can act like little bullets of energy and not like a water wave coming up to an ocean beach. So the distinction is blurred between we think of as solid stuff and kind of ethereal waves. And so it could within this question as well that again I want to emphasize that what we think of as spirit as God's maybe description, God is spirit, we would be way off base, even within the realm of hard science, to think that because God is spirit, he cannot solidly affect matter. That isn't even consistent with what we know of from physics these days.
Yeah, really, really insightful. Okay, maybe shifting gears just a bit. Sometimes you'll see people who are skeptics dismiss the case for intelligent design because they would argue, look, there is no evidence, tangible evidence for God, right? He's a transcendent personal being. At least that's what Christians posit, or at least people that hold to the Abrahamic faiths. And, there's no tangible evidence that the spirit exists. Therefore, they just simply dismiss the case for design altogether. And you point out in the articles that I read that this is really an unwise maneuver. So maybe explain why that's the case.
Well, I again could maybe take it back in a comparison to physics. Um, there are aspects of the physical universe that have been postulated to exist, and physical observations insist that, like dark matter and dark energy, are very real and they exist, and yet we have to this date no actual hard evidence for them, only kind of circumstantial evidence. We maybe see effects, or at least their supposed effects. But I think that the plausibility of, for example, the existence of dark matter is not lessened or made, negligible simply because we can't get a box of it and put it on the table and measure its properties. And so someone who says, I can't believe in God because I can't put him under a microscope and see him, or I can't hook him up to an instrument and measure him. Well, most physicists believe in this vast kind of percentage of the universe, which we call dark matter and energy, that we cannot do that with either. And yet we see evidences of it in effects. And I think that, someone would say then, taking the line of a skeptic, okay, well then what kind of effects do you see producing? And, that takes me back to the first question you asked, what are some of the more convincing, compelling arguments for God's existence? And I mentioned the fine tuning, I mentioned the existence of biochemical complexity in living systems. And in our conversation, I've mentioned the immaterial mind. So I think that it's not in any way a non-argument by a skeptic to say I can't believe in God because I don't have a measurable indication that he exists.
Yeah. Now, kind of along these lines, and hopefully this isn't a redundant question, but how could the spirit exist and be real without our capacity to perceive the spirit?
Well, obviously, it's a perplexing thing for many of us. It's like, okay, if God is real, and they would maybe hear from the Bible that God is with us, and yet we would say, okay, I don't see him, I don't feel him. How could he be anywhere, except on the far edges of the universe or something? But an answer again from physics is that within physics, it's entirely plausible that there are higher dimensions
Mhm.
of space and time that exist. And I don't think many physicists would dispute that. Um, it's not that we have direct evidence of it at this point, but it is almost like insisted upon or necessary to satisfy certain physical theories, these higher dimensions. And one of the aspects of higher dimensional ideas that I find fascinating is that uh, let's just talk about a being. Maybe it's a spiritual being. Maybe it's an angel or it's God existing in a higher dimension. Okay, so this is a fourth, fifth, sixth dimension of space, let's say, and we are trying to live in these three dimensions that we call our universe. But it's easy to show mathematically that a being in a higher dimensional space could be millimeters from us. In fact, could be inside of us. And yet we would not even necessarily be aware of it because our limitation as three-dimensional beings is that we are only directly able to perceive within these three dimensions in which we live. And so if something's in fourth, fifth, or sixth dimension, very close to us, they could be there, but we would be insensitive to it. Just like you know, an ant on a concrete surface of a garage floor or something. You could, hold a shoe an inch over it, and it might not be fully aware of that because it's mostly considering what's on the two-dimensional surface in which it is able to run around and move. So we run around and move in three dimensions, and we're pretty much unaware of what's going on in a higher dimension.
Yeah, and that's an extremely helpful insight because I think we want to be cautious when we talk about God existing in higher dimensions, but we could talk about angels. And so, what we understand to be spiritual beings, angels, for example, are really just beings that are higher dimensional, right? And it doesn't
Yeah.
mean they can't appear in this dimension, or at least in some capacity. They're just simply higher dimensional beings. And so they're just
Mhm.
as real and even you could argue physical as us. It's just
Yeah.
imperceptible to us.
Yes. Yeah. And that, maybe takes some getting used to that thought, but I believe it's at least consistent with what we know, say, from physics.
Okay, so now what I'm going to do, and hopefully this isn't unfair, is I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot and say, okay, now, Eric, apply some of the things you've talked about to maybe a concrete example or two. One of them would be regarding the origin of life question. I think both of us are on the same page. Look, it just doesn't look like there's any way chemical evolutionary mechanisms could generate the very first cells. And when you look at the very first cells, they just exude design in every aspect of their molecular operations and molecular structures. And so it does look like there has to be a creator that's involved in the origin of life. But then the question is how? How did that creator affect the origin of life? So, I've given some thought to this question, speculative, but I'm just curious, how would you say a creator affected that? Did the creator just speak life into existence? Did a creator maybe work within the laws of nature, but do things that were miraculous, hypernatural, you might say? So, what is your thought, and how does what we've discussed apply to this question?
Well, again, just to preface it, that I would be venturing out here into unknown territory,
Yes.
but I have thought about it a little bit from, for example, the just what we do know about physics. And one thought is to suggest that somehow God was some super efficient uh, creator of, let's say, a living organism. And we could start with even just a single cell. And, I did some basic calculations, and, it's like there are a lot of atoms within a single cell, even. And so if God is going to make a cell, he has to get all of those atoms together in the right orchestrated arrangement. And so some estimate that even a single cell contains something like 100 trillion atoms. And so God has to, if he is going to make that out of existing material that's, say, lying around in the vicinity, he has to move those atoms into the small space making up the cell and, of course, arrange them in a particular way. And I figured, okay, let's say that he has got all of the atoms necessary within maybe a meter of the assembly location. I mean, so that's pretty close, right? It must be a very rich, warm little pond, to use
Yeah.
someone else's wording. But and let's say that God, as the efficient assembler, can move these atoms, we'll just say at the speed of light. Okay, maybe not quite the speed of light, but almost. Uh, to move 100 trillion atoms into one location from an average distance of a meter away would take 333,000 seconds. So that's almost 4 days
Mm.
of a rapid one after another assembly of atoms, moving them in. Now, maybe God can move all kinds of atoms together at one time, but just go with my argument here. So almost 4 days to generate the arrangement of atoms corresponding to one cell. Of course, multicellular being could have hundreds of billions, trillions of cells. So it doesn't seem really plausible that God, as spirit or a creative agent, would create living creatures, of living things in this manner. And so I I kind of suggest, again, speculating an alternative is that perhaps God works more along the lines of parallel processing,
Mm.
uh, and perhaps just visualizes the creature.
Yeah.
And then his thoughts, instead of assembling atoms from a pool of resources, actually energizes our three-dimensional space to create those atoms in their requisite positions and arrangements and interconnections. And so it becomes a thought that generates matter, in this case, an arrangement of a cell, of the atoms in a cell, or even a whole organism, an animal, let's say, or a human being. And it just happens instantaneously, but energized again from something beyond our space,
Mm.
by this divine creator, visualizing it, thinking it, and then it becomes kind of actualized based on his thought.
Yeah, and so it seems to me that in your model that you're speculating about, um, that if God is generating atoms from, it would have to be from someplace else, because the amount of energy involved in interconverting energy into matter would be so enormous that you'd expect that it would have to be from a different dimension or a different realm beyond the physical material universe. Am I understanding that correctly, or am I off base there?
Well, I think that's a very good point that you raised. It's like, where did the energy come from? Because we understand with physics from Einstein's famous equation, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, that to create even a small amount of mass is a very energy intensive proposition. I think I calculated again that if you were to create mass, say, corresponding to just an apple-sized something, half a kilogram of mass, let's say, that really is a huge amount of energy. It's roughly equal to all of the energy received at the Earth surface by the sun in one day, and or not in a day, but in a shorter period of time. So it's it's all of the energy that's necessary to power a city for an entire year. And so it's prohibitive, we might say. But I would suggest that again, based on some properties of physics research that show that matter, like the electrons, photons that make up normal things, are actually oscillations of the space-time fabric of this universe itself. And perhaps God's could establish those oscillations
Mm.
and thereby generating what we perceive as matter. Um, but it's entirely coming from an effect outside of our universe. And so the problem of where does all the energy come from to generate the matter of, say, a new animal or something, that's beside the point because it's not coming from within our universe. It's being energized,
Right.
kind of oscillated or even orchestrated into existence by God's um, thought, if we want to say, from outside our universe.
Okay, and here's one more. Just again, we're having a little bit of fun. So thank you for being a good sport, Eric. What
Oh, of
about the
course.
miracles that Jesus performed? Let's say uh, creating the fish and the bread to feed the 5,000. How would you, in your model here, again, your speculative model, how would you maybe explain that miracle?
Well, I think that's a great question because we, could answer, for example, and going back to the skeptic who says, there is no evidence for God. I would say, well, let's look at Jesus. Here's some pretty strong evidence for God, a creator, a sovereign divine being, uh, being present in our world, and his miracles are well attested. And some of them were what we would call creative miracles, generating matter out of nothing, feeding uh, the 5,000, creating a multiplication of bread and fish to be able to, feed not just one or two people, but thousands of people. That's a lot of matter. And so this raises an interesting question. I was just pondering this today that what is the origin of this sort of higher level, we would call it spirit interaction matter that can physically cause an effect, like suddenly there's way more bread than you had to start with, way more pieces of fish than you had to start with, and it's enough to feed a multitude. Where could this come from? And it seems that, again, it must be accessing, um, again, to use, for lack of a better term, a higher dimensional realm, a spiritual God exists that maybe, again, he can and visualize this and call it into existence by simply setting up oscillations within the space-time fabric of our universe that then correspond to particles of matter that are corresponding to, things we eat. Um, but Jesus said some pretty amazing things to his disciples, including, if you have faith and do not doubt, you can do things I did, and even greater things than this. Which made me think, okay, is faith somehow a link
Mm.
between our physical world and the spiritual um, realm that is where God exists? And it seems that Jesus is suggesting that, and that it isn't off limits for normal people like his disciples and us to be able to see this happen. I think that that's fascinating. It's really gives you something to think about.
Now, one other question here, and that it has to do with the whole idea of miracles, because along the lines of what we've been talking about, many times skeptics just simply dismiss anything that evokes the miraculous, right? And you kind of
Yeah.
address that criticism as well in the articles that I read. So maybe touch on the whole idea of how does this discussion intersect with the whole objection to design and creation because of it is evoking the miraculous.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And it is an important point. It's a common objection to any sort of, not even just in the context of discussion of intelligent design, but even to sort of the existence of God as a theistic being who interacts at all with this universe. And yet I think it's somewhat short-sighted in the sense that we have examples of things happening in nature all the time that would not happen naturally. We're using technology here for this discussion. It involves the the laptop computer, the microphone, the cameras, the transmission mechanism through the internet. None of that would have ever come about in any corner of this universe if it weren't for intelligent agents putting them together. The laws of physics, which are, essentially these forces of nature that push or pull, would not be able to accomplish that, even if the universe were a million times older than it is. It's just not going to happen. So we don't say, oh, this is a miracle that we have anything that humans have made. We just think, oh, we made them. And C.S. Lewis has an interesting quote about this particular point. He says, we see every day that physical nature is not in the least incommoded or inconvenienced by the daily inrush of events from biological nature or from psychological nature, like ourselves. If events ever come from beyond nature altogether, such as something from God, she will be no more incommoded by them. It's like I think he also says something like, I'm free to move my arm. Can't God move his?
Yeah.
And I like that idea that we are sort of, in a sense, examples of free will agents in this universe who are doing things within the universe that are clearly um, kind of not miracles in this sense that they can't happen. Nature just sort of adapts to what we do. If I um, build a doghouse in the backyard, there it is. It probably would never have happened in any corner of the universe apart from an agent like myself doing it. And yet there it is. And we don't consider that some awful philosophical conundrum of how did that happen. So anyway, I think that certainly God, as a free will agent who has the possibility of either moving atoms around or generating new atoms from his side of the fence, so to speak, that's not impossible philosophical conundrum.
Now, I'm going to bring everything to a close by, again, putting you on the spot, Eric. You're such a good sport.
Oh,
But this is a response that has, at least when I read it online, was attributed to Bill Craig, right, about this whole question of the problem of divine interaction. And, his response was, look, we don't need a mechanism at all because God is omnipresent and he's omnipowerful. So, if that's the case, then do we really need a mechanism at all when we think about God's interaction with this universe?
well,
And again, I'm putting you on the spot, so I apologize.
yes,
But
yeah, no,
but just
that's a
you've
good
given
one
a
to
lot of
think
thought to
about.
this, so I just thought it would be fun to get your reaction to that.
Well, the key points that Craig is raising seems to be that because God is omnipresent, omnipowerful, there doesn't need to be a mechanism. And in a sense, I could just say yes. I humble myself and say I have no idea how an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God can work. I mean, he can do all things, and in ways we can perceive, in ways we can't perceive. He might use an intermediary. He might um, use things that are so far beyond us we couldn't even comprehend it if we tried. And so, God's ability is that unlimited. I would certainly grant that. And and so maybe this whole discussion of the interaction of spirit and matter is well, it's kind of like way out of our pay grade, and it certainly is. I'm sure, but nonetheless, I don't think that it is any sort of disrespect to God to try to imagine how this might happen. In the intent, really, of the articles I wrote, and I think today is to make more plausible the idea that God could, in fact, interact with this universe
Yeah.
in any way he sees fit, and he has certainly many more options than anything we've discussed today. So that just
Yeah.
keeps us looking for answers. It maybe keeps us humble that we may
Right.
never find the answers.
Well, and assuming that this is actually what Bill Craig argued, right? I'm not completely convinced that that's necessarily the case. It does feel a little bit as if you're kind of sidestepping a really significant, and in the minds of some people, a serious philosophical issue about, God's work as a transcendent creator interacting with his creation. So I really appreciate what you've done by just simply saying, again, hey, this is speculative, but if we can at least produce something that is plausible, then it could very well help somebody who is a skeptic, or maybe more importantly, somebody who's a genuine seeker, to help them draw closer to embracing the gospel message. Well, Eric, thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I really appreciate the effort and the thought that you put into this really, I think, important question. And so, again, we appreciate very much you taking the time to be with us here on Star Cells and God.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and God bless you.
And I want to say thank you to all of our viewers and listeners for joining us on today's episode of Star Cells and God. We would love for you to take part in the discussion that takes place in the comments. So please leave us your thoughts. Remember to like this video and to subscribe for new content. New episodes of Star Cells and God drop every Wednesday and are available here on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Be sure to share this video with a friend, and remember, the more that we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe in the triune God of the Bible.